Hello, everyone. Welcome. This afternoon's session is on the Canadian energy strategy. My name is Velma McColl with Earnscliffe Strategy Group. I'll be moderating this afternoon. Before I introduce our panel, I'd like to start by maybe setting the table a little bit on the Canadian energy strategy and where this conversation started. I guess it's 4 years ago now, a group of people outside of government started to ponder whether we were having a balanced conversation about energy and climate change in Canada. And so they began looking for ways to collect people together to begin a conversation. And there were a couple of groups convened across the country in many different fora. Many organizations care about this issue, so they gathered together and they began to raise the issue with governments and say, actually, in a changing global context, we need, as Canada, we need a pan-Canadian approach. We need to stop looking at the energy issues in balkanized, provincial ways and start looking at it at a national level. So a couple of years ago, Premier Redford and a few other premiers took that challenge up at the Council of the Federation and said, this is a conversation that we need to be having in the country. So the Council of the Federation embraced it. They issued an interim report last July when they met in Niagara-on-the-Lake. And they agreed that they would be issuing a strategy document in August of 2014 when the Council of the Federation meets again. For those of you that don't know, the Council of the Federation is the meeting of the premiers of all the provinces and territories in Canada. So we're in the midst of this process right now, and the work has been divided up between the governments. The governments are talking now, and they have split the work into three groups. And it's led, co-chaired really by three premiers, Newfoundland, Manitoba, and Alberta. So Manitoba has sustainability and conservation, and that covers energy efficiency and conservation, the transition to a low-carbon economy, and enhancing energy information and awareness, energy literacy, some people would call that. Newfoundland, who's not able to be here with us today, has the technology and innovation file. And that's accelerating deployment and development of energy research, human resources, and looking at the whole renewables side of energy. And then Alberta has delivering energy to people, which covers our transmission and transportation systems, access to markets in North America and overseas, and a discussion about how Canada should play in the international marketplace. So I just set that as context because not everybody knows what's going on in the energy strategy discussion. But you've got a great panel to talk about that. And so I'd like to introduce my fellow panelists here. We have, at my far right, the Honourable Stan Struthers, Minister for Manitoba Hydro and Municipal Infrastructure. He was elected in 1990 and has served in many different portfolios. We could take the whole session listing portfolios that this panel has served. Rich Coleman is the Deputy Premier and Minister of Natural Gas Development in the Government of British Columbia. He was first elected in 1996. Diana McQueen is currently the Minister of Energy, and she got there by what some people say is the best way to do that is by first being the Minister of Environment, and she was first elected in 2008. John Manley joins us today as the President and CEO of the Canadian Council of Chief Executives, and he was first elected in 1988 and served, as many of you know, in many roles in the federal government. And then Janet Ainsley, here beside me, is the Vice President of Communications at the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers.
Officially the least honorable person on the panel.
Yes. Your date to be elected is to come. So I'd like to start the discussion, Minister Struthers, with you, and just ask about Manitoba's in a leadership position in this conversation, and why you think it's important that we have a Canadian energy strategy, and what Manitoba's interest is in that.
Sure. Thanks, Velma. I'm going to cheat a little bit, though. I brought some backup. And he's sitting in the audience. He's my colleague, Gord McIntosh. He's the Minister of Conservation and Water Stewardship. Wave to us there, Gord. There he is. Gord's the driving force behind a document and a strategy called Tomorrow Now, which is our approach to including Manitobans in discussions about a strategy to move forward. We in Manitoba believe it's very important to get a Canadian strategy together. I have 19 years as being an elected official at the provincial level, and I've yet to meet anybody that doesn't want to grow an economy and provide jobs, and at the same time protect the environment and make sure we're doing things in a sustainable way. I think that means that from one jurisdiction to the next, we have to be very collaborative. We have to work together. We have to kind of get each other's backs once in a while and work to move things forward. In Manitoba, I think most of you know, we're kind of into hydroelectricity. Mm-hmm. And we talk in Manitoba a lot about that being our oil and gas. It's clean, it's green, it's something that many of our neighbors want to purchase from us. We have an economy in Manitoba that we're really diversified. We don't boom and bust. We're steady, little gains here, little loss there. We move along. We kind of like it that way. We tie it to a diversified trade strategy. So we know we need to tie that to a diversified approach when it comes to energy. We had a decent growth last year. All governments are faced with a global downturn that's been tough on everyone. So we want to make decisions that fit into a pan-Canadian approach, whether that's on the economic side or an environmental side. Before I got into this business, I was a school principal, and I was a school principal at the time of the Rio conference. Uh-huh. And my little school in Rorketon, Manitoba, K-12 school with 150 kids, they really got motivated by the discussions that took place in Rio. A Manitoban, Marie Strong, was head of that. And the students that I taught then are now adults, and they've got children, and they're taking jobs in our economies, and they're becoming positions where they can make decisions. I think what we need to do is we need to, across the country, tap into that and tap into it together. And have from that flow a pan-Canadian approach that's going to serve our economies and our environment well.
Thank you. And so BC, I think everyone knows BC was out of that discussion for a little while and then came into the Canadian energy strategy discussion. So can you talk a little bit, Minister Coleman, about where you see BC's interest in a national conversation and what's changed for BC in energy and in global markets to make Canadian conversation important?
Well, I think that's a pretty big question. But I think you start at the point where you have to look at what your energy aspects are internal to your province, what you need to run your own industrial complex, things like electricity, which we have hydroelectric power as well in BC. We're the only jurisdiction, I think, that where we have maybe not the only, but we have a working carbon tax that is actually working within our system. We've had it for a number of years on the base of the carbon piece of energy. The important aspect for us, though, on this discussion is a numberfold. Number one, we're basically Canada's Pacific Gateway. We're where the ports are that will access Asia to be the resources from Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and other places across the country. So we're very happy yesterday we solved this little port dispute we had because it was costing Canada $126 million a day. I think what we need to recognize is a national energy strategy is not about quote-unquote oil, gas, or a specific product. It's really about what are we going to build to have a participation in the global economy to make sure we have sustainable resources long-term for things like healthcare, education, and those sort of things in Canada. And that comes down to a strategy that includes the overall aspect about what are we doing and what can we work together on. So we have a relationship on oil and gas with Alberta. We have a relationship with the prairies relative to how they move their goods and services to the port, etc. But the important thing that has to happen when you do a strategy like this is you can't forget what it is you're trying to accomplish. So in our case, our biggest focus on liquefied natural gas. We now have 13 major proponents from around the world prepared or looking like they're prepared to spend billions of dollars that will have a significant impact on Canada's GDP. That brings with it some challenges similar to what Alberta lives with in Fort McMurray. A strategy nationally in this country has to include everything right down to our skills training and the people who are actually going to be able to deliver on the ground affordably, competitively in a global economy. When I took on this file and now sitting with major companies from around the world, negotiating with them on the whole structure around this, as we reach our competitive piece, which I think we're at, right to the top is going to come the one thing that will affect final investment decision in Canada. It will whether be here or in Alberta or anywhere else for any major growth that we're going to expect, and that will be labor. The experiences in jurisdictions that haven't got the labor piece part right, that they've seen as much as a 45% increase in cost. Industry doesn't want to invest on that basis anymore. So the message has to be, how do we as a country make sure that flow of skilled labor and training and those jobs and opportunities for the next generation can be dealt with as we do build our resource economies and have a national energy strategy. Because as we're sitting here today, people are leaving because they're retiring from even the other sectors that are affecting an energy strategy, whether it be retiring out of oil and gas or retiring out of mining or whatever, which is leaving this echo of people that we need to fulfill. So our important aspect in national industry is that it is a network of planning that gets us to where we can deliver on moving those resources to the markets we need to move them for the Canadian economy, for the next generation and the generation after that.
Thank you. Minister McQueen, several people have, as I was walking the halls the last couple of days, several people have said to me, with Premier Redford's resignation, does the Canadian energy strategy die?
So I would say first and foremost, one of the great leadership qualities that Premier Redford had was, first of all, talking about the Canadian energy strategy. And I think if we know in the history of Canada and other strategies or programs, it really was Alberta that needed to start the conversation. And so I give Premier a lot of credit for that. But it really was about how do we, as a province, when we look at the vast resources we have, to be, the third largest proven reserves of oil and gas in the world globally, how do we also look at the nation? There's so much in this nation that we're all, as provinces and territories, have to offer the globe. How do we actually have that conversation and make sure that as we come together, what's important for us as our provinces and territories, that we actually then are looking at it on a global. So when we're out talking about, we can talk about Canada as a whole and what we have to offer, and then to bring it down to the work that we can do as provinces together and territories on regional projects. And for us, it really was about building upon what we have in the New West Partnership. So BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, the work that we've been able to accomplish there, right. Let's take that strategy there. But really what it is I think what our premiers across the nation have done have started the conversation and then really empowered ministers across the nation to really do the work and the lifting. And that's where we're at right now. So what we're doing now, although Premier has stepped down as Premier of Alberta, this will continue. This work is too important for Alberta. It's too important for all of our provinces and territories. And so it shouldn't be about any one leader because we all serve at a certain amount of time. And if the strategy is sound, which it really is extremely sound, it's above any one of us as leaders as elected officials. And so I think that's the strength of it. The strength of it is what we're seeing from this is from Alberta is when we look at the markets that we're accessing for us in Alberta and the projects that we have, we look to certainly to British Columbia, when we look to Eastern Canada, and we certainly look to United States, It's not just what does it benefit for Alberta, and that's always been our stance. How can the development of the oil sands and what we're doing, how does that development benefit the rest of the nation and other provinces and territories? And so that's the discussions that we're having, really important discussions. And when we work with different provinces in Eastern Canada or in British Columbia or as the New West Partnership, we really take that look at it, because the Canadian oil sands are so important for us as a province, but nationally as all of the provinces. When we look at manufacturing, when we look at the upgraders, the refining, all of that, everybody has a place to play. And frankly, in Alberta, we need the markets to get to the East Coast, to the West Coast, and certainly as well to United States.
Great, thank you. John, in your role as speaking for corporate Canada, when you look at an energy strategy, you've certainly heard some things that I'm sure resonate with your members. CCCE has been quite outspoken on this, so maybe you could talk about some of the reasons, in addition to these three perspectives, why it's important to your members.
Well, you're right. We've been very involved in this since the earliest days. You mentioned, Velma, that first conversations were about 4 years ago. But when you think about the energy sector,
sure,
and you go back 4 years, is there another sector where there's been so much change in the surrounding environment in which we're dealing? I mean, we've gone from the United States being the largest importer of energy in the world to being, in some categories, an exporter. This is a big change. And I have to say that maybe we're a little bit prescient even 4 years ago, thinking about the fact that we actually needed to devise a strategy, because we had this notion that here we're sitting on these vast resources, oil and gas, yes, hydroelectric power, yes, lots of innovation around renewables. Dare I say it, we even have lots of coal. We are a very wealthy country. But we kind of assumed that our big neighbor was so thirsty that no matter what happened, they would just keep drawing resources from us, paying us generously for it. And when you just think about it, I mean, Dan Jorgen was in Ottawa earlier this week, commented that the federal revenues from the oil sands are equal to half of what the federal government contributes to healthcare in Canada, that it's equal to the GDP of Saskatchewan, our fifth largest province. These are big, big numbers. And for anybody, any country in the world, sitting with those kinds of resources in a very rapidly changing environment would have to say, how do we optimize what we get for this? This is how, as the Canadian family, this is how we pay the rent. So I think when you put it in a business point of view, I mean, there isn't a large business in Canada that doesn't spend a lot of time every year doing a corporate strategy, doing a business strategy for how to succeed. Do we think that just because God put the resources in the ground, that therefore we're going to be successful? Do we not think that maybe we need to develop a strategy? Why would we, as a country, yes, the resources are owned by the provinces, but why would we allow systems to develop where we have different standards applied depending on which region, that we would have different approaches to sustainability, that we would not find an ability to speak with a common narrative to our neighbors, whether it's about pipelines on one hand, or whether it's about whether hydroelectric power should meet the renewability standards for U.S. regulation. We've got a bunch of issues that we share because we all share as Canadians in the ultimate outcome. So absolutely, I think business thinks, let's try to build a strategy here.
Great. And Janet, I mean, I think people understand why CAP would be interested in an energy strategy, but can you maybe talk about some of because you're interested in the broadest possible definition of the strategy. It's one of the things that's been interesting is that as the conversation has developed, I think everyone has agreed, every jurisdiction has agreed that there needs to be a balance, that it needs to include the conservation and the carbon picture in renewables and technology and innovation. So can you talk about some of the things that CAP is interested in the Canadian energy strategy beyond the market diversification?
Well, certainly, as the largest producer in terms of a sector of energy in Canada, we've got a lot invested, and we've got a lot potentially to lose in terms of our member companies. And as Minister McQueen outlined, we've got such a tremendous resource. As Mr. Manley indicated, we can't just trust to leave this resource that it's there in the ground. We actually have the opportunity to turn it into production. And I think as Canadians, we have a choice about the manner in which we do that. And setting about purposefully that manner means a lot to my members. In the most basic terms, from a business perspective, it's about certainty. It's about knowing that there will not be any kind of, say, knee-jerk policy reaction as a result of environmental impacts, that those are being managed appropriately as a result of Aboriginal consultation or legal issues, that it's about setting out that framework. And I think that's an important term when you say putting it into a broader sense. Albertans still get a little bit shuffly on their feet when we talk about a national energy anything.
Right.
As a child growing up in the 70s and 80s, it's still a loaded term.
That's why we say Canadian energy strategy.
Canadian energy strategy or energy framework.
Yes.
And looking at the idea that as oil producers and natural gas producers, we know that there's this growing need for energy globally, growing in many ways exponentially. That's been the topic of conversation here over the last couple of days. And how do we meet those needs in a world where we're supposed to be reducing our overall carbon output? And those are very hard to reconcile. And as Canadians, when we look at the broader aspect, and many of CAP's members are invested aggressively in renewables, as aggressively as any other companies in the world, and looking at how we reconcile the fact that we've got a 60% of our grid is actually from non-emitting hydro, but we have uranium reserves, that we've got plentiful natural gas. In fact, the U.S. has reduced a lot of its greenhouse gas emissions by simply switching to natural gas from coal. So how do we actually make a choice about how we're going to develop these resources in a smart way in terms of the environment, but also in a way that benefits us all economically? Because I don't think if there weren't jobs in this industry for Canadians and government revenues, then and fundamentally the energy supplies that are delivered, then the reason for being for the industry would be greatly diminished. So we need to explicitly outline what we want to achieve as Canadians from our energy sectors, plural, and I think set about a conversation on how we achieve it.
So a lot of the concern about the energy strategy has been, yes, we're rich in natural resources. Yes, there's lots of opportunity, LNG here in British Columbia, hydro, oil sands, similar resources across the country. But I think in order for the public support to be there for a Canadian energy strategy, there needs to be other things in it. So perhaps we could just take a minute and talk about, and Minister Struthers, maybe you'd like to start, because Manitoba's leading that piece, to talk about the carbon piece of this and climate change and how considerations there factor in, and on the energy conservation side.
Well, sure. I think it's pretty obvious that we have a lot of, I think, very tangible opportunities within our grasp. The other thing that's within our grasp, excuse me, is to get it right. There are social responsibilities. There are, I'll use Manitoba Hydro again as an example. We, in the old days, we would build a dam in northern Manitoba, flood out a bunch of communities, First Nation communities, may or may not compensate them after. Today we do it differently. Mm-hmm. Number one, we've got, on the engineering side, a much better way of not causing the flood in the first place. But we sit down with the First Nations in the areas and we bring them in as partners, equity partners in some of the cases that we do. We work with them so that job and training, because I think there's lots of opportunities for jobs and training. I want people in northern Manitoba to be beneficiaries of these. Mm-hmm. The other people I think we want to make sure benefit from this comes from the conservation side of this, and making these good decisions that create wealth work for people who I represent in the constituency of Dauphin in the western side of Manitoba. So a couple years ago, we had an energy savings act that we brought forward, and it introduced a pay-as-you-save program where people could, through their hydro bills, they could retrofit in their houses and actually over the long term pay for that retrofitting through the savings that they achieve because of that decision. That really works well for my constituents. And I deal with people a lot of the time who feel left out of the creation of wealth in our jurisdictions. I think we have to think of really practical ways in which we can make that translate for people locally. In many ways, our country has been defined by that debate about whether we go north-south with things, or whether we go east-west. Railways, post offices, post services, the Canadian Football League. There's lots of examples. Being a Blue Bomber fan, maybe I shouldn't have brought up the Canadian Football League this year after the year we had. Thank heavens there's nobody from Saskatchewan on the panel.
That's right.
But
You do have the Grey Cup game, though. Weren't you just awarded the Grey Cup game
Absolutely,
for 2015? There you go.
Not this year, though.
Come to Winnipeg in 2014.
2014.
After you've been to BC in 2014. We're 2015.
Yes.
Sorry. I was trying to muscle in on you there, Rich. And Manitoba, we contribute to a north-south kind of a day. We sell power to Minnesota, and we sell power to Wisconsin. We're doing our part in terms of trying to broaden it out east-west. We do have an agreement, a $100 million agreement with Saskatchewan. So we're creeping west on you guys. We have a memorandum of understanding. Premier Selinger and Premier Wynne signed here just a few weeks ago, an MOU having to do with innovation and having to do with promoting clean power. And that's part of what Manitoba's job here through the Council of the Federation. It's the old school principal in me. I think we need to work on education. We need to work on awareness and setting it up so that our constituents can legitimately, knowledgeably talk about the things that matter most to them when it comes to energy and protections for the environment and protection for people who are impacted by the decisions that we make. Yeah. So again, I think that speaks to why we have to have a collaborative view of this, one jurisdiction to the next. Alberta and Saskatchewan sends us a bunch of water. We make the best use of it. If that flow of water stops, so does our optimism when it comes to hydro. We want it to run over dams rather than through our basements.
Yes, fair enough. Yeah. Fair enough.
But Velma, this point about conservation, I hope we don't move away from it too quickly, because it really is the best unit of electricity that you can produce is the one you don't use. Right. If we can build a real culture of conservation in Canada, then this will contribute really significantly to improving our performance in terms of GHG emissions, improving the utility and making more available for export for other purposes. But it really comes down to our population really understanding that it's not just a supply issue.
Right.
It's a demand issue also, and that means all of us.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Diana, would you like to add anything here?
Well, I think when we look at it and when we talk about it a little bit to build upon with regards to the climate piece, and we look at in Alberta back in 2007 being the first jurisdiction in North America to put a price on carbon through legislation, and have done it a little bit different. And I think that's part of the Canadian energy strategy that works as well.
Right.
We don't all have to do it the same. We take our responsibilities seriously as provinces. Ours is different. We put large emitters over 100,000 tons can either choose to reduce emissions, they can buy any one of the 34 offset credits, or they can pay into a technology fund.
Right.
And for Alberta, what we truly believe is technology is going to be the game changer. For us to reduce our emissions long term into 2050, it is going to be about technology. About 70% will be through CCS, and that's why we've made such a strong commitment of $1.2 billion in Alberta on 2 CCS projects. And so what we look at is the work that COSIA is doing with regards to technology.
Canadian Oil Sands Innovation Alliance.
Right. because you don't normally see big companies like this that would actually share that technology, which has normally been so held together in their own companies. This is another area that we look at. With us, with the technology fund, we have an arm's length body that manages that fund. And we right now, we have about 51 clean energy projects that have come out of that. So about $300 million, leveraging about $4 to $1. So $1 billion technology fund for clean energy projects. That's how we do ours. BC may do theirs different, other provinces may do theirs differently, and that's okay. When we look at the reductions that we want to achieve, even in per barrel reduction on intensity, 26 to 29%, that's a huge amount. Now, Alberta is growing. The oil sands, we are feeding the world globally, and we're proud to do that and proud to speak about that. But we're also very proud about the point that we take the environmental pieces very seriously and the reductions and with regards to our climate change policy. And I think having come from environment first, I think that was very brilliant of our Premier to have a minister that is now in energy, to have the background in environment, sustainable resource development, and really looking at that piece of it. The other piece that we've really done well, I think, in Alberta that a lot of people don't know is we've really taken a broad approach. So we look at integrated resource management, and we look at the land use plans that we're doing in all the watersheds and making sure we're setting aside large tracts of conservation for future generations. The Independent Monitoring Agency for Air, Land, Water, and Biodiversity to have a science advisory board. So it's not just about the climate piece, it's also our single regulator that we've created for the efficiency effectiveness. So when we look at the development of our resources in Alberta, we take a holistic approach to it, making sure that we're looking at the climate change piece, the land use piece, the water reduction use, and certainly all of it as a big picture, because all of those pieces are important pieces of the whole puzzle as we look at strong environmental responsible development while we are developing our resources.
Right.
If I could just wave the sort of the company flag here for a moment, it's that technology, whether it's for greenhouse gases or whether it's for air emissions or for reclamation, it's not just pure altruism, in case you were mistaken why companies are investing billions into this. It's because it's potentially exportable technology. That state-owned oil and gas companies globally are not innovative. They don't innovate as aggressively as the private sector does. And globally, the world barrel is getting heavier. So all of these technologies that we are pioneering in Alberta can be exported around the world. And that's tremendously exciting. And that is a pillar of the strategy, or it should be.
Yeah. And so it's interesting because, as you said, there's so much that's changed in the global energy markets, but there's so much that's changed in terms of the public expectation of what should happen on the environmental side. And do you want to speak from, you spoke about the carbon tax, and BC's obviously a leader.
I think you have to remember where we've come from to start with and recognize how adaptable we're going to have to be.
Right.
It was only 7 years ago that we paid down one of the largest pieces of our debt, the largest debt reduction we've done in history. We were living in a gas world at a price where our royalties gave us that ability to do it. Today, that revenue to government has dropped probably about 10% about what it was 7 years ago. And any strategy you build has to recognize where your marketplace is and who your customers are.
Right.
So British Columbia today sends more finished forest products to China than it does the United States. I was the forest minister in 2005, 2006 when we negotiated this off with Lumber Deal. The U.S. took 85% of our product at that time.
Right, that's
so
not
as
even
we
10
adapt,
years ago.
we're adapting to standards that people want to put on us or expect of us, and we have products that can help countries that deal with some certain issues that are not so prevalent in maybe some of our economies.
Right.
The classic would be if you've been to Beijing, you know intuitively if you're there for 2 days when it feels like you smoke 2 packages of cigarettes a day that they need to clean up their air. And natural gas can help them do that. But you have to get into their marketplace and their customer, and a national energy strategy has to recognize how you're going to move those goods and services, but at the same time while you're doing it, to remember you're going to be adaptable. Because the market could change very quickly as to where those products can go, what value you can get for them, and that affects everything we do. Because if a company is trying to look at making a $20 billion LNG investment in British Columbia, they need to actually establish their markets, their customers in advance, because it's such a significant investment that they need to be able to do that. And they need to know that our strategies, our environmental assessment stuff is strong, how we're going to manage that, how we're going to manage permitting, so they can decide to make an investment. So when you have a strategy, the reason on a national basis is important because sometimes our approval processes overlap each other. And we need to harmonize that, because if we can harmonize that, that basically can still have the highest environmental standards in the world, but you have an ability to actually deliver, because otherwise you may wake up and have your resource sitting here and not have a strategy to get it out because you haven't adapted.
Right.
Wouldn't you say, Rich, that there's also the fact that the U.S., Australia are moving ahead with some of these projects, and we can't just assume that the demand is going to be there forever, that we can just take as long as we want and be as complicated as we want. We've got to get some of these things going.
John, that is so correct. I mean, the window for liquefied natural gas is probably the next 5 to 7 years, and then there will be a drop-off, as some of the world's supply is picked up. And so we have to recognize that when we're doing our business cases to attract the investment to a jurisdiction. We have advantages and disadvantages. Our advantages is our resource is such, because we do a royalty regime, you can buy oil and gas leases, you can have a stability of supply. Right. And you won't, in the U.S., for instance, when the spot market moves, it can move quickly and it can really affect your shipment of a particular product somewhere on a very short window. They want to have long-term stability within that window to make the long-term investment. So we're there as far as that is concerned. But you're absolutely right. It's becoming more and more of a challenge, and it's a challenge simply because we have to be, as a country, able to deliver on everything, like I talked about skilled labor earlier, but all the infrastructure that goes with that. Right. Or they'll go build a plant in Mozambique, or someplace like that.
Yeah, and you're talking about those very rapidly changing global dynamics, and those dynamics are changing for things like clean technologies as well.
I dealt with that when I had the energy and mines portfolio as well with hydro. So we were in a world not that long ago where we were looking at buying clean energy at market prices around $110 a megawatt. Today the spot market would be down around $50 a megawatt. Sure. So the criticism government gets today for buying those, going into long-term contracts for clean energy, is you paid too much. And they say, now you're subsidizing these companies because you're buying this power. Because everybody looks at the whole time, but what will that look like over a 30-year period is the question about the business case for that clean energy. And what happens is the pressure comes back the other way from the ratepayer saying, don't buy that power. Right. And yet, at the same time, they'll flip over and say, make sure you're buying clean energy. So, it's...
We're in a transition. There's no question about that.
There is.
And there's some hard trade-offs.
We used to make a fortune in the spot market in the U.S. Now we're just trying to make a little bit in the spot market in the U.S.
So let's talk for a minute about how Canada's brand is viewed, because this was one of the big discussions that we had, that part of the reason why we needed a Canadian energy strategy was, as a politician said once in a meeting, he said, Hugo Chavez has a national energy strategy, why can't Canada? Because the other thing is that people don't understand, without that broader context, how Canada approaches these things. And you've probably felt the pinch more than any industry that Canada's brand globally has been affected by the fact that people don't see that balance in how we approach energy, or don't perceive the balance.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. They don't perceive what Canada does well. And they look at some of our heavy oil assets and say, that's carbon-intensive crude. And it's become a real poster child for climate change. And it's not to say that we, as oil sands producers, believe that we can reduce carbon emissions from the oil sands to a level on par with the import barrel. And it's looking at what relative benchmarks will make sense globally that people can relate to. But it's also having the strategy so we can more clearly articulate where we're headed in the future and what our values are as Canadians and what we represent. I think it's, to me, when I travel and people don't realize our hydropower in this country, and if you look at a greenhouse gas emissions map of North America and look at all the coal-fired electrical generation on that map, it's shocking. And there's no bubbles.
It's in the U.S.
It's in the U.S. And there's none of these little bubbles over Canada. And why don't we get any credit for that?
Yeah, so there's an interesting discussion there. Before we open up for questions, I want to talk about, I was on a panel this morning, and we talked about the governance side of this, that we are going to need innovation not just in technology and in our approach to markets, but that we're going to need innovation in governance. And I would argue that what the Council of the Federation is doing by having the premiers from the provinces and territories sit down and talk about an issue that's in their jurisdiction. And just because of the nature of the vehicle right now, the federal government isn't at that table, but provinces are saying, yes, let's have the conversation. And you talked about sort of coalitions of the willing. It's not the old days of federalism where we write one strategy and it's got to fit across all 13 plus federal jurisdictions. It's a mélange, it's a mix and match of people with shared interests. So can you talk about some of the things that you're seeing happening in your conversations? You know, as energy ministers, you're the leads for this file. So are you seeing areas where Canadian jurisdictions can cooperate a little bit more or break out of a traditional mold? Sure.
You know, I think the innovation is really, and it shouldn't be the innovation, but it actually is when the conversation started 4 years ago. And that really opened the doors when the premiers all came together to talk about this and to talk about what we could do. Because it opened up the doors to talk about if we're going to be a global energy supplier as provinces and territories, as a nation, then we need to make sure that we're looking at things that are important to global people that want to buy our products. And so then it opens up the doors that we can have regional discussions on where those may happen. And I think that has really helped us a lot. It's also, when I look at the Canadian energy strategy and I see Premier Wynne a few weeks ago in Toronto hosting a session, and we're here talking about it, it really is now that it is truly a Canadian energy strategy. And we are having those discussions because for us in Alberta, to move our products is really important. But we need to have the conversation with BC and with other provinces in Eastern Canada about what is the benefit for them. And also, what is the benefit for Canadians? And I think even for Canada as a whole, for all Canadians as a whole, to understand how much this nation has with regards to all of the aspects of energy, from renewables to oil and gas and everything in between. I don't think people realize how much we have here, and that's been really quite a lot of the innovation. Then the other piece talks about how do we then share technology and innovation as provinces and as industry and people coming together, certainly, and having the discussion, of course, that would be broad enough that we feel comfortable in having the discussion from all spectrums. So from really people with regards to the environmental groups and all of us, how do we collectively develop our resources in the best way that we can, responsibly, but also putting the balance of communities, of the social, of the economic piece about it, because as Minister Coleman said, if we just look at the environment piece but we can't afford then on the economics piece, then we don't have the jobs and we can't develop our resources. It's about finding that balance and then finding the technologies by working together and sharing that discussion together, and by working together on projects that may be regional or on projects that may be national. And I think that's what the Canadian energy strategy has really talked about. And now we're actually on the ground doing those projects, whether they be from renewables. We look at the amount of renewables that we have, other provinces have as well. But the learning and the sharing, and just the investment we have made with regards to CCS is just one example. That we will share across the nation, certainly in the United States, we look at the number of coal plants there, Asia, other countries. So it's that sharing of the investment of technology and innovation that we all can't, that we need to share collectively. So globally, we end up sharing.
Sure.
Yeah.
Mr. Coleman, want to add anything?
Well, I think the minister covered it pretty well. The thing that I think where this started really was back with BC and Alberta doing TILMA, which basically said, you know, we have to have this internal trade mobility and regulatory things sorted out between jurisdictions. Now it's at the New West Partnership. And really what it comes down to is a red-sealed mechanic in British Columbia should be able to go across anywhere in this country and go to work and be recognized. You know, those type of aspects of your mobility of your workforce. Because if you don't have that, then you can't actually deliver when your markets shift within your own country to actually produce the stuff. And you know, if you don't, you end up with situations like we have on a gas plant in northeastern British Columbia today, where the labor cost has gone up by 25%. The labor cost is up by 25% because we don't have enough skilled labor. We're competing between jurisdictions. And then the investor says, I don't want to build another gas plant until you sort that problem out. So,
Right.
and internationally, you know, Canada is a pretty safe harbor. I mean, our reputation internationally is good. When you go to Asia, they want to do business with Canada because geopolitically we're stable and all of those things. But you have to make sure your strategies within the country can deliver for those people that are interested in coming here. At your standards, they're happy to meet our environmental standards and those sort of things, but you have to make sure your strategy internally to the country is in such a way that it's as seamless as possible to understand what's going on between one jurisdiction and another.
Right, and the conversation has certainly, the level and sophistication of the conversation has certainly increased. Minister Struthers.
Well, we can't slip back into those days where we were scrapping over who owns the resource and all of those kinds of discussions. That's so 70s, right?
So analog.
So analog, yeah.
They didn't tweet about it back then.
No.
That's so far back in the days of the Maple Leafs actually having a hockey team.
It's a good thing Premier Wynne isn't here.
Yeah.
You know,
I used to be.
You know that neither one of our teams is making the playoffs
Yeah,
at this point in time, right?
Yeah, coming from a Winnipeg Jets fan now, yeah.
Yes.
We can't go back into those days, but we have lots of opportunity to cooperate with the federal government. I mean, in their last budget, they just announced a nice big Building Canada fund
Sure.
where we're going to pave the daylights out of everything moving, and there are responsibilities that we all have when we make those kinds of decisions. Environmental responsibilities and responsibilities to people that we represent. I don't get too pessimistic about things like that. I mean, we got to deal, New Flyer buses in Winnipeg sold 20 hybrid fuel cell buses to British Columbia. I think you used them quite well during the Winter Olympics. Mm-hmm. We have opportunities out there to grow our economy, do it in such a way that is sustainable on the environmental side, and somehow we find ways to trade amongst each other, even though it sometimes seems easier to trade south rather than east-west.
Yeah, fair enough.
So I remain really optimistic about being able to be sustainable and move forward and grow our economies in a sustainable fashion.
Yeah. So I'm going to open it up to questions from the floor. There's a mic here, so if you'd like to ask a question, I welcome you to go to the mics. But I mean, I just feel it's important to mention one of the other limitations of the current process, which is that through the Council of the Federation, because it's there with the premiers, First Nations are not invited to that table. Premiers, the way the process works, the premiers meet before with the AFN and First Nations leadership, but they're not fully in the discussion about the development of the energy strategy. And I think pretty much every jurisdiction recognizes that that's a bit of a gap. And John, I know CCCE issued a paper last year, I think, talking about the importance of the First Nations component in a viable Canadian energy strategy.
I think, yes, we did. And I think it's clear. We've got great ambitions for the utilization of the resources that we have. But we can't get there from here if we don't engage the First Nations communities, especially when we're looking at developing projects where their land is involved. In many of the areas where we have shortages of skilled labor, there are First Nations communities. We need to figure out how we use that human resource, give them the training that's necessary in order to ensure that their communities benefit from the utilization of the resource. This is Canada, and this will only work if we include First Nations communities in our endeavor.
Yeah, and we've certainly seen over the last couple of years, and there's certainly been a lot of talk about it here, that First Nations communities are also interested in being their own project developers, their own energy developers, whether that's up north or various renewable resources or on the technology side. So I think that's important to mention. I'll take a question from the floor. We want to just start with the timing of the strategy. I mean, I think the Council of the Federation is meeting again in August, and it's the expectation that you'll be releasing the strategy then. But correct me if I'm wrong. The suggestion is that the document, it's not going to be a document that goes on a shelf somewhere. The idea is that it becomes a framework and an ongoing discussion. So maybe.
Yeah, my understanding is that will come forward, I believe, in August of 2014. Our Premier, Premier Salinger in Manitoba, along with the other co-chairs, have indicated that it's not going to be something that gathers dust. They want it to be something that will have some outcomes flow from it. So depending on what I suppose the discussion entails in August, then they will from there make it more public.
And that it's also a living process, because I mean, I think everyone recognizes that at some point the provinces are doing this, but the federal government's going to have to get engaged at some point as well. Do you want to respond to the question about subsidies to fossil fuels?
Sure. In Canada, at least, the fossil fuel industry is definitely a net contributor to governments in terms of royalties and taxes, whether it's provincial or municipal or federal. The issue of subsidies, and it was tied to innovation in the question, is we think there's a limited role for tax incentives and other programs related to innovation, whether it's in the oil and gas industry or it's in any other renewable or type of technology, that there's a clear technology funnel, and that things like government investments in carbon capture and storage, those types of technologies at the front end of that technology curve are absolutely required. But to actually be a long-term technology, there is a pure commercial test, and that you do need to look at things, and you have to remove that subsidy lens. But at the front end, whether it's CCS or whether it's another type of renewable technology that there is a limited role for subsidies. But also in Canada, and a lot of the international data, I want to say, is distorted by petrol subsidies, where state-owned companies and in countries where their resources are state-controlled are actually subsidizing pump prices for consumers. Right. And I can assure you that's not the case in Canada.
Yeah, so it's a very complicated subject area, and you're really raising the question about Canada meeting international standards. Are there other questions? Thank you. So he's describing perfectly a set of global dynamics that are going to affect British Columbia and Canada.
And they're continually changing. But like I said earlier, we have 13 companies here, serious investors looking at LNG. I would say that one of the companies will make a significant final investment decision by the end of this particular calendar year. The partnerships that are here today are companies that have been in this type of resource management for decades. You have Shell, BG, Chevron, you have Petronas, you have Woodside out of Australia, you have CNOOC, Nexen. We have all of these partnerships. Some of them have already optioned and paid non-refundable money on land. Others have signed land deals where they are. To date, in British Columbia, there's been about $7 billion invested in just working towards final investment decision by these companies and pipeline routes and those sort of things. Our job as government is to make sure we're globally competitive. We're there. We will be as competitive as any jurisdiction in the world with regards to our fundamentals on this. We know that now. We will move that out very shortly so the industry has that certainty. We'll also give them certainty through legislation on what that fundamental looks like come fall when we go into a fall session. We've committed to that. And as we do that, we know that we have different things that affect us. How is the U.S. going to deal with natural gas from their brownfield sites will have an effect. Whether Qatar is going to decide to go out and do some more drilling or add supply. Whether the supply from Russia would come by pipeline into China. But China is a very big country, and there's lots of places that a pipeline from Russia wouldn't be able to serve. The global demand is growing, and it's pretty dramatic growth. And so what we are is we're in the game. and we intend to win on our end for the benefit of Canada. The reason is probably a larger BC thing is because we have the ports, we have the Crown land, we have the resource, and it's a big benefit to Alberta, who also have natural gas they'd like to move to Asia, but certainly the control of the stream and the permitting and all of those things are within the purview of the province of British Columbia to make this happen. And so we're focused on it, and I do know, because I've sat in the boardrooms of almost every senior executive who deals with natural gas globally and talked to them directly, that we're on the right track here.
And I think just to add to that, when we look at the importance that Minister Coleman has talked about LNG for British Columbia, certainly very important for Alberta as well to support British Columbia with that and working with the federal government, because the amount of gas that we will have to help supply the LNG plants is extremely important for us. So we see, though, as you have mentioned, there's a short window here that we need to be moving quickly. I know Minister Coleman and Premier Clark certainly working very hard. This is a strong priority. We in Alberta certainly support that, because we know that it's going to be a benefit for us as well to support that and to work together as two provinces with the federal government to move this quicker.
Right. So I'll take one last question.
I think that one's directed at me, so I'll take that one. You know, I think what it is it's really important for us to look at, and I really do mean this, having come from the Environment Ministry and moving into the Energy Ministry is really important. So we take the responsibility of the development very, very serious. With that, we are going to develop our oil sands, but we're doing it in a responsible manner. One of the things that with the technology fund that we collect from the $15 per ton, as I mentioned earlier, into Climate Change Emissions Management Corp, is they have an X Prize that's out right now, and it's a global X Prize to take carbon and what can that be then turned into a positive use. And so there was many countries that have actually been shortlisted for that. Looking at over 200 applications, will be shortlisted down to 20, and each one will receive a certain amount of money for that, because there's so many big innovative ideas out there. We want that to be global, because there's a lot of people around the world that have very good ideas. And so it's, again, taking what the carbon, how do we turn that then, because we are going to produce the oil sands, and so how do we then take innovation, technology, and ideas to turn that into a positive? I think that's where we're globally, we need to have the conversation and say, how do we make sure that as we're going to develop resources, whatever those resources are, how do we find the benefits of that as well on the environmental benefits too, and the technology that's invested for this? So they've got $35 million that they're doing as an X Prize to make sure that we can see some of the best minds come forward with that. Carbon capture and storage is another piece of that for us as well. The technology will take some time. We've got 2 commercialized projects in Alberta. There's 19 worldwide, globally, that's happening. And so some of that's going to take some time to get commercialization. But I would say all of us are interested in making sure that we're taking the development of our resources and doing them in a responsible manner. But some of that does take time. Anybody else?
Does anybody else? Nope. Great. I'd like you to join me in thanking the panelists today. I think there is some innovation going on in the country. We've certainly heard about it here at Globe. You'll hear more about it this afternoon and into tomorrow. So, and watch the space for the Canadian Energy Strategy as the provinces to continue to work to release something in August of 2014. Thank you all.